We are now 31 months into a conflict that frankly does not seem like it's going to necessarily end anytime soon, which also means we are 31 months into sanctions programs that were instituted immediately after the war started, probably also with the expectation that they would not last as long as they have. And as I said last night at the reception, as someone who has written and taught a lot about global political economy and also written and taught a fair amount about economic statecraft, while the two are obviously linked, for the longest time in the global economy, you could take a look at sanctions programs and say, well, they're by and large segmented. They don't really have systematic impacts on the global economy. And the fact is that we're now operating in a situation where that's no longer the case. This is true for a variety of reasons, the most obvious of which is that we're now in a world where great powers feel comfortable sanctioning each other. The extent to which that actually then has any real world economic effects is in no small part the topic of this conference. However, we're going to start by having Peter Harrell, who is now a non-resident scholar of the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Prior to that, was it Treasury or NSC?
Yeah, NSC.
NSC. One of the, would architect be too big of a word?
No.
It would not. One of the
The
architects.
Russians sanctioned me,
There we go,
so,
yes. Hey, they sanctioned Professor Miller as well. They didn't sanction me, frankly. I'm a little hurt. But we're going to talk to one of the architects of the sanction program. Peter's going to speak for, I believe, about 20 minutes. I will then ask him many insightful questions, and then we will take questions from the audience. Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Dan, for that introduction. And it's great to be here at the Fletcher School this morning. Sanctions and trade controls have a long history, going back to at least classical Greece. And in fact, there's some evidence that embargoes might be older than that, potentially dating to the Hittite civilization that existed in the Bronze Age in modern-day Turkey. In American history, sanctions go back to at least President Jefferson in 1806. And as Cornell historian Nicholas Mulder illustrated in a book that came out 2 years ago, the modern age of American and European sanctions, which relies on complicated international financial and trade networks, dates to the First World War. I'd say in the US, sanctions have been a growth industry over the last 30 years, with the Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations each setting records for the numbers of sanctions imposed. The Clinton administration in the 1990s developed modern US targeted sanctions with so-called kingpin sanctions targeting high-level drug traffickers. And despite some policy concerns, signed congressional legislation that created the first secondary sanctions on Iran and Cuba. Bush aggressively deployed sanctions on terrorist groups in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Obama imposed sanctions on Iran, Syria, human rights abusers, and other targets, including Russia, after its first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And President Trump deployed maximum pressure campaigns on Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela, as well as more limited sanctions campaigns against other threats. So against that backdrop and long history, it should come as no surprise that sanctions and export controls were a prominent part of the US and G7 response to Russia's most recent invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. I know we have a great agenda here in front of us, and we'll talk about with panels that'll talk about specific impacts of sanctions and export controls on Russia, Russian and Western adaptation measures, and the implications for financial markets, energy markets, and other major geopolitical competitors, notably China. But to open the conference, I want to speak about 4 cross-cutting lessons that I think we should draw from the last 31 months of US and G7 sanctions on Russia. The first topic I want to discuss is how the sanctions campaign on Russia has affected the credibility of US and allied sanctions generally. I think for those of us who work in foreign policy and in national security, credibility is important. If our adversaries do not see our threats as credible, our threats are unlikely to deter them or to shape their behavior. Let me start with the good news. US and G7 sanctions and export controls in the months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine clearly demonstrated that we were both capable of imposing economically impactful multilateral sanctions and that we were willing to do so. Asset freezes and financial sanctions froze hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian sovereign reserves and largely cut Russia's largest banks out of transactions with Western counterparts. The European Union kicked some of Russia's largest banks out of the SWIFT financial messaging network, an action long viewed as a sort of nuclear option when it comes to financial sanctions. Multilateral export controls began to cut off Russia's ability to source semiconductors, industrial inputs, and luxury products from the West. But when I think about Russia's perspective on the credibility of US sanctions, or the perspective of another potential adversary, China, I think we also need to be clear-eyed about the less good news. If I were sitting in Moscow or Beijing, I'd assess the West sanctions not only by the measures that the West imposed, but also by the measures that the West did not impose. And seen through that lens, I think the West has proved remarkably reluctant to impose sanctions that would impose substantial collateral economic costs on the sanctioning states, even if they would be impactful on Russia. Here, we need to look no further than the Western experience with energy sanctions. From the beginning, Western policymakers were wary of cutting off Russia's energy exports, by far Russia's most valuable export product, given the impacts that a cutoff could have on global prices and in Europe on the physical supply of energy, particularly natural gas. Well, the US and Europe did largely prohibit our own imports of Russian oil in the early months of the war. The governments did so in a way that ensured that the availability of Russian oil would remain on the market to other willing buyers like India, China, and Latin America. This was witting. Western policy officials did not want to import Russian oil themselves, but also did not want to deal with the global energy price shock that would have come if Russian oil came off the market. Later in 2022, when Western capitals did begin to move a bit more aggressively against Russian energy, they did so in a narrowly targeted fashion, coming up with a price cap that tried to reduce Russian energy export revenues without reducing Russian energy export volumes. The same pattern played out with respect to other forms of Russian energy. When it came to Russian natural gas, as opposed to Russian oil, gas being harder to substitute because of pipeline and LNG networks, Russia itself did at least as much to cut off sales to Europe as Europe did to reduce its purchases. The United States took more than 2 years, only earlier this year, to pass legislation cutting off our own imports of Russian nuclear fuel. And that law allows continued imports into the United States to 2027, if needed, again showing a profound wariness of sanctions measures that impose collateral costs. Of course, it's understandable that Western policymakers shied away from sanctions that would have imposed substantial economic costs on ourselves. Governments have to worry about their domestic economic interests as well as foreign policy priorities. At a time of high inflation, measures that raised costs for Western consumers could also have undermined political support for Ukraine and for holding Russia to account. I did not mean to argue that Western policymakers necessarily should have taken a different approach, given all these interests. But the US and our partners should expect that our adversaries will draw the lesson that the West is wary of imposing sanctions that carry major collateral costs. I think that has real implications as we think about the sanctions we might threaten on China if it invaded Taiwan. We must also be clear-eyed about another potentially troubling lesson our adversaries will draw. While the West sanctions have been expensive for Russia, they've not been existentially expensive. Indeed, in many ways, they've had more modest economic impacts than initially hoped. Russia has been able to spend its reserves, shift its economy to a war footing, and sustain positive economic growth. War production and Russia's social safety net have kept most Russians employed, and there have been relatively few protests about Russia's economic situation. Russia has had to find new suppliers for industrial inputs, notably China, and for weaponry, notably Iran and North Korea. This has raised costs. But if Russia succeeds in achieving its military goals in Ukraine, I fear Vladimir Putin will view sanctions simply as a cost worth bearing. The second topic I want to discuss is the implementation of sanctions, and particularly export controls by the private sector. Multiple research reports, including some by the Kyiv School of Economics, and press accounts have documented Russia's ability to keep procuring sensitive goods despite Western controls. In some circumstances, Russia is procuring goods made in the West and then transshipped through third countries before arriving in Russia. Trade data, for example, shows large spikes in exports from Europe to several of Russia's smaller neighbors and corresponding spikes in exports from those neighbors on to Russia. In other circumstances, Russia is sourcing products that Western firms manufacture in third countries, particularly China. Think semiconductors that American firms, Taiwanese firms, or others might manufacture in China. And of course, Russia has also worked to find Chinese company and other emerging market-made substitutes for the products that formerly sourced in the West. A research paper by the Kyiv School of Economics released earlier this year found that Russia imports of battlefield components, things recovered like missile parts recovered in Ukraine, are essentially back at pre-war levels. And trade statistics similarly suggest that Russia's overall imports by the end of last year were approaching pre-war levels. At least from a macroeconomic perspective, implementation of the sanctions and export controls has been a mixed bag. In the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the US Treasury Department not only imposed a lot of new financial sanctions, it also used changes in its approach to enforcement to prod US and global banks to overhaul the way they implemented sanctions. Officials used enforcement actions and multi-billion-dollar fines to persuade banks here in the US and around the world to toughen know your customer standards and to develop and deploy expensive new analytics software to spot and stop suspicious transactions. Banks today are by no means perfect in their compliance with sanctions. Lots of illicit money still moves through the Western financial system. But I do think the days where a sanctioned individual or company could simply hit a computer key and move millions via wire transfer are over. Instead, sanctioned companies and entities have to turn to elaborate schemes, to non-Western banks, to cryptocurrency, to cash, and other smuggling mechanisms, which raise costs, reduce the scale of transactions, and impair objectives. And alongside an enforcement focused on banks, the West also set up the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, to prod governments around the world to improve their own anti-money laundering and sanctions legal regimes. I think one of the lessons of the last 31 months is that we need something similar for export controls. Indeed, in recent months, the US and G7 seem to be waking up to a need for a greater focus on compliance. The US and G7, for example, have released a variety of compliance guidance documents to the private sector to help with implementation, and have begun putting pressure on banks to ensure that they do not engage in financial transactions related to sales of goods that would violate export controls. But it's time for governments to do more to push the private sector to invest in export controls compliance. This means pressing companies to invest more in data and analytics, companies beyond the banking sector, and also in potentially physically tracking and tracing export-controlled goods so that the sellers of at least high-end devices can turn them off if they show up in Russia. I think we may also need a new FATF-like body for export controls to prod key emerging markets to adopt their own export controls regimes. The third topic I want to discuss is the lessons of the past 31 months for the future of US and Western economic leverage, the ultimate source of sanctions economic impact. As Henry Farrell and Abe Newman argued in their 2019 essay and 2023 book, and also in a book that Professor Drezner, collection of essays that Professor Drezner recently edited, at a conceptual level, sanctions work because they weaponize economic interdependence. The US takes its ability to control an important global economic choke point that uses that leverage to impact the trade and financial flows, even of countries far removed from the US. In recent decades, the role of the dollar and of US banks in international trade has been one of the most important of these choke points. For example, US sanctions on Iran were impactful, at least from an economic perspective, in large part because oil was priced in dollars and traded in dollars, and access to the US financial system is important for large companies around the world. This meant the US could use sanctions to make it difficult for countries to pay Iran for its oil and could threaten costly sanctions on companies that bought or shipped Iranian energy. Taken together, this made it hard for Iran to export. The Obama administration succeeded in reducing Iran's oil exports by more than 50% in the run-up to the JCPOA nuclear deal in 2015. And Trump, after he withdrew from the JCPOA, reduced Iran's oil exports by an even larger percentage by 2020. More recently, as Professor Miller has written extensively, the US has sought to weaponize our control of semiconductor manufacturing. Export controls have made it harder for Russia to get the semiconductors it needs for weapons and industrial production. And the US is trying to limit China's access to advanced semiconductors to slow China's development of AI and other technologies of the future. The US can do this because virtually any advanced semiconductor made today, and many of the older ones, use technology from the US or one of just a handful of US allies at some point in its supply chain. This creates an economic choke point even for semiconductors that are themselves made outside the US. Conceptually, one could imagine other points of leverage. An adversary government that depends on US email and IT software providers to run its corporate network would seem to run the risk that US sanctions could cause the government's IT networks to go dark. A decade ago, I met with a foreign automotive executive who said to me that, well, at that point, 10 years ago, the US could force him to stop selling cars in Iran. In the future, when cars are constantly connected to the internet, the US could force him to turn off cars already driving on the streets of Tehran. Indeed, it's precisely that risk in reverse that prompted the Commerce Department just this week on Monday to publish a draft rule that would limit Chinese companies from selling autonomous driving software and certain other connected vehicle products in the US. Unfortunately, as our new rule with China illustrates, our adversaries have caught on to the game. Particularly since 2022, China has stepped up efforts to develop payment channels that could sustain its trade if it lost access to the US financial system. While I do not expect the RMB to replace the dollar as a reserve currency, we have to expect that China will develop payment channels that could allow it to continue trading with key allies and partners, even if the US imposed substantial financial sanctions. Russia and China are actively working to end their use of Western technology firms and to develop their own supply chains for semiconductors, information communications technology, and other tech. I believe that the US and our partners are likely to sustain our technological edge over China for at least the midterm. But I also think that China and Russia will likely build enough indigenous capacity that they can meet their basic economic needs, even if they're cut off from the West. If the US and our allies want to sustain our leverage against these efforts, we need to more actively work to promote it. In my mind, this starts with more actively embedding US technology and US companies in the global economic order, the way we did in the wake of the Second World War and in the wake of the Cold War. Take, for example, the growth of cryptocurrencies. I think the US would benefit if US companies were at the forefront of cryptocurrency innovation and could thus be compelled to cut off rogue actors trying to exploit the crypto ecosystem in the years ahead. I think the US government should advocate for US technology firms to be deeply embedded in IT network infrastructure around the world. The more we can keep economic and technological interdependence, the longer we'll be able to weaponize it to our advantage. Sustaining leverage also requires slowing down the efforts of our adversaries. After the US cut Russia off from most Western banks in early 2022, Russia began to promote its own alternatives, such as its so-called Mir payment network to international counterparts, going to Turkey and other countries and saying, connect to Mir. By the summer of 2022, Russia had succeeded in convincing a number of banks in major emerging markets to connect with Mir, giving Russia a financial network outside of Western influence. But it wasn't until February of this year that the US actually sanctioned Mir, sending a message to those emerging market banks that were tying up with it that they might face costs for also signing up with the Russians. We should have acted much sooner to slow down Russia's efforts to develop its own payment channels. Similarly, I expect that China will one day succeed in having its own financial transaction network to connect with other key emerging markets. It is in our interest to push that day off as far into the future as we can. The final topic I want to discuss is lessons from Russia sanctions regarding how policymakers should think about the goals of what sanctions can achieve. In the 1980s and 1990s, policymakers in Washington tended to see sanctions as an ineffective tool. Jimmy Carter's 1980 grain embargo on the Soviet Union was widely panned as ineffective at convincing the Soviets to stop their invasion of Afghanistan, and it was costly to American farmers. Indeed, in his 1980 presidential campaign, Ronald Reagan, hardly a friend of the Soviets, actively promised to end the embargo if he was elected. A decade later, it was military force, not sanctions, that evicted Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Many experts saw US and UN sanctions on Iraq in the decade following the first Gulf War as having little positive geopolitical impact while contributing to corruption and the humanitarian suffering of the Iraqi people. This perception of ineffectiveness changed dramatically after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. George W. Bush's Treasury Department imposed sweeping new sanctions to prevent terrorist groups from moving money through the formal financial system. In the early 2010s, sanctions on Iran caused Iranian oil exports, as I mentioned, to fall by more than half. They also cratered the value of Iran's currency and caused the country's GDP to slide. US and allied diplomats then parlayed that economic pain into a deal with Tehran over its nuclear program, though Trump later exited that deal in 2018. As my former colleague Liz Rosenberg said in testimony to Congress several years ago, sanctions became a tool of first resort for American policymakers, particularly given the nation's exhaustion from decades of our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Today, I think Russia may be pushing the pendulum back. While many political leaders in Washington remain keen to use sanctions, at least to do something, I think the skepticism is riding. Experts at conferences like this one, or writing for journal and editorial pages, have cited Russia's economic and geopolitical resilience alongside the failure of sanctions to constrain Iran after Trump terminated the JCPOA, and Nicolas Maduro's entrenchment in Venezuela to question just how much return the US gets on its sanctions investment. Just a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump used sanctions actively when he was president, remarked that he wants to, quote unquote, use sanctions as little as possible if he's reelected, and that he worries sanctions are undermining the position of the US dollar. Against these swings in perception, I come back to a line that Richard Haas used in testimony he gave to Congress in 1998 when he was at Brookings. Under the right circumstances, Haas said, sanctions can achieve or help to achieve various foreign policy goals ranging from the modest to the fairly significant. I think Russia illustrates this point. International sanctions on Russia have undeniably been useful and undoubtedly succeeded in imposing costs. Assets are frozen, oil and gas revenues are reduced, and challenges, albeit not insurmountable ones, have been imposed on Russia's war machine. Surely the US and its G7 partners are much better off having imposed the sanctions that we did than if we'd not acted. Degrading Russia's war machine is a useful line of effort, even if the most important fights are the military ones in eastern Ukraine. Frozen assets can be used to help pay damages to Ukraine, even if Russia decides it doesn't want to bargain for sanctions relief. But I think Russia also reminds us that we need to be realistic about the goals we think sanctions can achieve and not expect that they're a magic foreign policy bullet. So in closing, I just want to thank you for giving me the time to speak today. For better or for worse, I've professionally worked on sanctions for more than 15 years, both in government and out. A fascinating and important tool, and I enjoy speaking to audiences like this one, which include both deep experts like Professor Drezner and several of you around the room, but also students and others in the university community who are just beginning to learn about how this set of tools works. With that, Dan, I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, I get to, this is supposed to be a fireside chat, so the privilege I get is that I get to ask Peter a couple of questions, but in about 10 minutes or so, I will be asking for members of our learned audience to also chime in. So start thinking about those questions now. I guess the first question I have is something you didn't exactly address, but I'm sort of curious, which is basically the unintended consequences of sanctions. So if we look at the sanctions on Russia, you're right, Russia has survived, but one of the things that I find disturbing is the degree to which Russia is now almost entirely a war economy. That one of the traps they're facing is their economy, ironically, is booming because all they're doing is paying for defense. But if by some magical, outcome, the war ended tomorrow, Russia's economy would face incredibly acute shocks. And one of the concerns, I think, is Russia now in such a war economy that in fact they're going to continue to fight even long after they need to, because they don't know how to switch back. Let me start with that. Like, what is your takeaway on that one? And that's mostly due to the war, but it's also obviously due to the effect of the sanctions.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think policymakers do and need to keep thinking about what are the unintended consequences of our actions. And of course, we saw that in some of the historical cases. And I mentioned the 1990s sanctions on Iraq, which had, I think, an unintentional consequence of UN corruption emerged, and there was enormous kind of corrupt smuggling networks that emerged throughout the Middle East. I think this is an old problem. It's interesting. I think over the last couple of years in Washington, the kind of sanctions policy community has gotten a bit better at analyzing unintended economic costs. There's been a real effort at Treasury and elsewhere to stand up some analytic capacity, sort of, if we do this, what will be the impact on markets? What will be the, impact on commodities, et cetera, et cetera. And sort of, I think there's a growing awareness we need to think about the unintended economic costs. And I think there's also been a growing awareness, and we've seen some steps, including in late 2022 with a bunch of new general licenses to try to address the unintended humanitarian costs. There's been more of a focus on how do we make sure this doesn't impede food, medicine access, and that kind of thing. So I think we are seeing policymakers focus on that. To your sort of broader question about what are the unintended geopolitical consequences, that's when you don't see nearly as much analysis of. I mean, I think it's a weakness across the U.S. government if they far too rarely sort of put themselves in their adversary's shoes and try to understand from the adversary's perspective how you're going to react and what are the steps you're going to take and what is that going to mean. And I certainly agree with you. And I did not mean to suggest otherwise in my remarks. The costs of the sanctions on Russia are real, and it has weathered them in part by radically reforming its domestic economic model. Something we probably should have expected but didn't when we were imposing it, sort of illustrating the point. I don't know. I mean, it's a fair point. Are they going to sustain the war for economic purposes or bounce back? I don't know. But I agree that this is sort of, in addition to thinking about the unintended economic and humanitarian costs, sort of unintended geopolitical factors, probably another one we should be looking at.
So one of the things you didn't also worth bringing up is that ironically, the Biden administration was keenly aware of potentially U.S. overuse of sanctions. There was the 2021 Treasury review in which, Liz Rosenberg, among others, played a part, acknowledging that sanctions were a tool of policy option of first resort, as it were. So I have a very simple question. Is it possible for the United States to not sanction? Or do we need to start a sanctions anonymous group where we can sort of say, it's been 20 days since I sanctioned last? Or in other words, to what extent can the United States, from a strategic sense, there's obviously risks of abusing the tool, but obviously when a crisis emerges, it is still the policy option of first resort. I guess my question is, do you think there's any institutional mechanism whereby U.S. policymakers can, remember that when a crisis emerges, or will always be the case that the urgent will outweigh that sort of longer term concern?
So I think that's a great question. I mean, I remember, and I agree, the Biden administration came in thinking we don't want to overuse this. And Jack Lew had been Treasury Secretary under Obama, gave this kind of farewell speech where he warned about the risks of overuse. I mean, more personal level, I remember when I got hired into the White House, told to build my team, this was a transition, I reached out to a guy I knew then at OFAC to bring him over to detail him over to work for me for a year at the White House. And he'd been a sanctions guy, and I was like, I told him, this is gonna be great for you. It'll be, your job is gonna be, at most 10 to 20% sanctions. We'll be broadening. We can do all this other stuff because we're not gonna be using sanctions all the time. And I sold him this bill of goods. Third week on the job, there's a military sort of meltdown in Burma, and basically he was doing all sanctions, after that particular example. So I've not seen a lot of evidence we can get away from it. Although I do think over the this kind of calendar year, we have seen, at least out of the Biden administration, some sincere efforts in the Venezuela context to try to pivot to a not sanctions first strategy. And that doesn't mean giving up on sanctions, but it does mean what we've seen them do is put more of a focus on sort of symbolic targeted sanctions that they know aren't going to have real economic impact, but to kind of check that box if we need to be seen as doing something. But we sort of understand meaningful economic sanctions won't actually change the outcome. And to sort of get into a little bit more, so Trump had imposed maximum pressure sanctions in Venezuela, took a bunch of Venezuelan oil off the market, sort of isolated them financially, starting in 2018, 2019. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator down there, more entrenched than ever. We just saw that there was an election, an election a couple of months ago that he clearly lost, but, is persevering. And I think we saw the Biden administration kind of come to a conclusion on Venezuela. Look, Maduro's a horrible, evil dictator, but he's not going to go anywhere. And that's just been our lived experience. And there are other U.S. interests vis-a-vis Venezuela. It's a huge source of migrants coming to the U.S. It's a huge source of cocaine, drug trafficking, major regional destabilizing activity, big problem. And so we need to kind of figure out a way to, manage this unfortunate situation rather than thinking that our sanctions are going to force Maduro to go. And so you've seen them adopt an approach where they have sort of recalibrated the sanctions to focus less on major macroeconomic measures and more on what are some targeted things that, like, we're hitting him, we're hitting his cronies, but we're also not sort of using this as a, trying to use this as a regime change tool.
You're not trying to destabilize the Venezuelan economy, despite Maduro's own best efforts to
he's doing that plenty well on his own.
I'm intrigued by your proposal that, the U.S. needs to try to be more proactive to insert itself in sort of key technology networks, whether it's crypto or IT networks and so on and so forth. And in some ways, this always raises the fundamental question when we talk about weaponized interdependence as a phenomenon, which is, to some extent, it almost has to happen by accident, right? Like, the question is always, why would a state ever agree to have their economy tethered to a network where they're asymmetrically dependent on another actor? And the answer seems to be, from what I've read, is that neither the central node nor the other actor realized this was going to happen until much later, and then you're able to exercise that leverage. I guess my question is, do you think it's possible for the United States, or for that matter, any country, to consciously try to pursue this strategy without generating automatic sort of wariness among other actors?
Well, so I think there's an interesting question of, sort of today, given what our adversaries have seen, can we? And I'll come to that in a moment. But I would actually think in the past we have, I look at like the post-Soviet era, 1991. And I would argue, I agree, it was not to eventually weaponize the financial system, but certainly the U.S. government strongly encouraged Western banks to move into the FSU, former Soviet Union states, and actively worked to embed our financial network infrastructure across Eastern Europe and in Russia. So we have a history. It may not have been for the purposes of weaponization, but we certainly have a history of going out and advocating to keep ourselves as a central node in the global economic order. The other thing where I think, I take your point, Dan, that we're not going to, it's going to get harder and harder for us to get China to say, I'm happy to be dependent on the U.S. It's not going to happen. But that's not necessarily the way to think about it. The question is really, can we push enough of our own infrastructure and enough of our own relationships onto a number of China's sort of emerging market global South trading partners that we can put pressure on them to, curtail trade with China, even if China is, sort of taking these steps to insulate itself, right? So I think that's where you're going to see but I think cryptocurrencies are an interesting example. So there's a huge global market out there for and growing. It's now several $100 billion and growing quickly for so-called stable coins, right? This is a coin that is stable in value that can be used for a medium of exchange. More than 95% of the value of stable coins is actually U.S. dollar-linked stable coins, because actually, people like the idea. I think the dollar is stable.
There's a reason why
right?
dollars are
we can control, and they want U.S. dollar stable coins because if you're trading between Argentina and Brazil, having a stable currency there is useful, and stablecoin lets you do it. Some of those U.S. dollar stable coins now are basically run by foreign companies, right? That we can't compel as readily to kick bad actors off their blockchain. I think we have an interest. There's commercial demand for these U.S. dollar stablecoins, and I think we have an interest in American firms kind of dominating that market because we will have leverage. And it'll spread because of commercial factors.
All right, I got one more question, and then I'm going to take it to the audience, which is, I really appreciated your point about, in some ways, U.S. policymaker attitudes about sanctions almost follow a pendulum where, on the one hand, it's like they don't do anything. They're just purely symbolic to these things are amazing. We should use these things all the time. And your point about the pendulum swinging back from Russia is well taken. I guess my question is, as someone who studies these things, the answer I always give is, well, yes, there are situations where they are going to be incredibly useful. But if you're trying to sanction a great power to give up land that it is conquered through blood and treasure. You could impose the greatest sanctions in the world and it's not going to accomplish anything. I guess my question is it possible for policymakers to not ride that pendulum? Or is this just an inevitable feature of trying to engage in coercive diplomacy in real time?
I think it probably is an inevitable feature. I mean, just realistically, I think it's probably an inevitable feature. I very much agree with you. And I think Vladimir Putin looks at this Russia experience and he's like, I think Russia knew they'd face serious economic risks. We certainly signaled it to them.
Yeah.
Big credibility on that. I think he assumed he'd take a number of percentage points of GDP. I think he also had kind of a view of, nice real estate's expensive. It's just kind of like the way this is going to go, right? And I think that's unfortunate. And I worry about that as the precedent, though, because I do think we have sort of signaled that, well, there will be costs if there is a geostrategic, objective that our adversary decides is worth those costs. They just, they'll price it in into what they do. I also take your point, but your point, and you've done, obviously, you wrote a report a couple of years ago on sort of effectiveness and sort of 30%, effectiveness. And I do think what we do see, and sort of the point, the Haas line I quoted, like we do see sanctions continue to be effective on these more modest goals. I give one, I think the Trump administration had one incredibly effective sanctions experience. So there was a period after Turkey invaded northern Syria, beginning to hit several U.S. Kurdish allies in northern Syria. And Trump imposed actually fairly substantial sanctions on like Turkey's defense ministry, which is obviously embedded with the U.S. equipment because NATO ally, on Turkey's energy ministry, which is going to create problems for energy sector. And basically said, and what you have to do to get out of these sanctions is, stop shelling the Kurds. And Turkey did it. And 3 weeks later, the sanctions were gone. And I think that was an example of like, you hit heavy on a very limited objective with a clear path forward. And it was, I think, a very successful and a clear policy objective, demand, like policy demand. That's what I mean. Yeah. I think it was a very successful example.
All right. With that, I think it's time for any of you to ask questions for Peter. I'm going to ask you to identify yourself when you do ask the question. Craig, we'll start with you.
Craig Kennedy of the Davis Center. First of all, thank you for a really interesting presentation. And I've got questions about 2 points that you brought up. One about analytic capacity and whether we're properly resourced in order to take on the challenge of sanctioning an economy as complicated as Russia's. And secondly, we talk a lot about weaponization, which is sort of an offensive use of sanctions, but I'm also wondering whether sanctions are thought about as a form of prophylaxis of protecting our own systems from the corrosive effect of continuing to deal with an adversary in this type of situation. And I want to just drill down a bit more on both of those two questions to help you understand where I'm coming from. But I approach these from a slightly different perspective. I haven't been in government. I haven't set policy, although I spent the last couple of years extensively consulting with people in government about energy sanctions policy for Russia. But my background is initially as an historian of Russia, but then I spent 20 odd years in finance and in energy as well. So I look at this very much from the point of view of banking and cash flows. Yeah. And the thing that struck me at the outset of 2022 is the Treasury did what Treasury does well, and that is trying to put pressure on the financial infrastructure of the global economy or around Russia. And so we sort of closed a few valves, but we left wide open the valves that most mattered, and those were for energy flows. We purposefully actually announced that we were not going to sanction the banks that were managing both the oil and gas flow. And I also think that we made it very clear to Russia initially that we were not going to sanction oil and gas. If you read the early statements coming out of Washington, they made it explicit. And so when we say that Putin knew that we were going to go after him, I think they understood we would go after the financial architecture, but not the energy side of things. So I'm wondering whether we have enough, you go back 20 years, you had lots of people who had expertise in the government on Russian energy. But after the Cold War, we lost that capacity. Are we looking to retool and build that back up again so that in addition to the financial expertise, we also have expertise in energy and industry? to help us understand how to make those sanctions more effective. We're learning, but we're not there yet. And then on prophylaxis,
Actually,
go ahead.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
think
That's fine.
let's go with this.
Yeah, so I think this is a great, both great questions. On Russian energy, I could not agree more. I actually think that the issue, it was less of, there was no shortage of analytic capacity on Russian energy flows. I think the issue was the analytic capacity looked at what would happen if we took a bunch of Russian energy off the market, and policymakers on the economic side were, no, that's not worth it, right? And I think that goes into the sort of point on credibility of sanctions that I spoke of at the beginning of my remarks, which is that I think the U.S., not just in the Russia case, but actually if you look back historically since 9/11, at least in sort of the modern era, we have been unwilling to take sanctions that have substantial collateral economic costs. And in fact, we've built up analytic capacity to identify those collateral economic costs to avoid them, which is a good thing, because I was dual head of the NEC and the NSC, and so I had inflation as part of my portfolio too. But I think it is not an analytic capacity thing. It is a we as a country for 30 years now making a decision. We impose lots of sanctions, but only where the costs are asymmetric, not where the collateral costs on us. And that's a judgment we have made. Way above my pay grade across many administrations, but it is a reality that our adversaries look at. And I think about it on China, because if you're China, you think about invading Taiwan, you look at this and like, okay, the Americans might impose sanctions on me that cost me 3 percentage points of GDP, but you know what? They love their iPhones. And I think it does give our adversaries a sense that they have leverage here, because we're not willing to take collateral costs. On defensive sanctions, so it's interesting. No, we have not done much of that. And I think it is unfortunate. I think we are beginning to do some of this, more particularly with China, where we're cutting off our own imports of certain Chinese technologies in order to ensure that we aren't dependent on them. But historically, we have thought about, at least over the last 30 years, we've thought about it more offensively and less defensively. I mean, I had sort of a view when we first thought about sanctions on Russia, or some of these things, like we should actually do a screen of like, what are things that is in our interest to cut off, just defensively. And that just got no traction, with policymakers. People think about it as a, put pressure on them tool rather than a protect ourselves. I think this is very much something we should be thinking about more. And I think we're beginning to on China a little bit.
Other questions? Rachel.
Rachel Ziemba. You highlighted, I think, really well, one of the unintended consequences, but I'm interested in your thoughts about to what extent did the US and Western allies misinterpret the strength of Western financial systems? I'm thinking particularly about the dark fleet and the sort of growth of illicit financial networks. It might not be dominant, but I'm wondering about how much you worry about the expansion of those areas. You mentioned stablecoins, which I think is another area where the U.S. thinking about how do you take the fact that these are linked to the dollar and make sure there actually are enforcement nodes. And I know that's something people are thinking about. But just wondering about to what extent, as larger and larger countries are targeted and you end up with illicit pools in different areas, how much do you worry about that? And related to your first point on credibility, I know the political system is such as sometimes you need to do something. But if there is this element of just doing symbolic sanctions, is this just a step on the way to realizing we need other tools? Or does this just add to the credibility problem? I know there's 5 questions there, so answer.
Look, I certainly think we need more tools, and if I sort of am thinking over a 10 to 20 year period, I think that we've sort of viewed sanctions as I think rightly sort of between diplomacy and war. And that has been both a sort of, well, here's a tool we use, but we've also taken a view from like an international law context that we can impose all the sanctions we want, and it doesn't constitute an attack under international law, and so shouldn't invite retaliation. Whereas other tools like cyber strikes you could think of, we've long taken a view actually do cross that line. And we may have to like move some of the cyber world back into a, like, this isn't an act of war line, because I think we may have to rely more on that going forward. And we want to do that without that then bleeding into armed military conflict. On the price cap and sort of the thing, so I think we definitely underestimate, kind of goes back to this geopolitical impacts. Like, we look at the economic impacts of what we do. We definitely underestimate how our allies react. I mean, we saw this with Russia. Like, we were trying to trigger, when we first imposed sanctions, trigger capital outflows. Of course, Russia just responded by putting capital controls on, right? I thought with the price cap, I long have advocated, if we wanted I have long, because I've worked on sanctions for a long time, I have long advocated that if we wanted this price cap to work, we were going to have to aggressively threaten the buyers of Russian oil with sanctions, put pressure on the buyer vector. Because ultimately, if we don't put pressure on the buyer vector, the Russians were going to do exactly what they did. They're going to like buy a bunch of ships, they're going to ship it around. It's not like we have some magical control over the whole shipping network. But, I think there was also, I think some American policymakers, they could never do that. But, our enemies are adaptable. They are skillful. Especially like Russia and China. And we have to understand and do more to put ourselves in their shoes to cut that off. I think we could still make the price cap more effective by going after buyers. We've sort of chosen as a policy matter not to do that.
Yep.
Eddie Fishman, Columbia University. Peter, in your remarks, you said that in some respects, the economic impact of the sanctions on Russia were more modest than you and your colleagues at the NSC expected. Two questions about that. First is, what did you expect the economic impact of the sanctions to be on February 22nd? And this is understanding that we were sort of not going after oil. Like, what did you actually think the financial sanctions and export controls would do in the immediate term? And second of all, what surprised you most? Like, what were you most wrong about? And in retrospect, you're like, wow, we got that one wrong.
So great question. And, I'm not going to get into sort of all of the internal assessments that we were doing at the time on economic impacts. But I think you saw, sort of in the first weeks after the war, some of the folks like the World Bank and the IMF and outside economists saying, this could have a 5 to 10% hit on GDP. And I'd say that was kind of the ballpark that, we were, and it just didn't, at least in year one, it didn't. I do think, over many years, we probably have succeeded in slowing Russia's growth by more than 5, sort of where they would be absent all the sanctions by 5 percentage points. But, I think it'd be fair to say we thought it would be more like that up front. And I think it's related to sort of the thing. And as I say, I think some of us at least fully expected the adaptability on oil once we started doing it. I think we didn't appreciate some of the things that in retrospect seem obvious. Like, of course, you're going to impose capital controls. We just didn't appreciate they actually have skillful financial managers, many of which trained in the West and worked at Western banks on their side, to be able to make sensible macroeconomic and financial sort of markets responses to our measures. The other thing, and so, I think it puts me in a position if we need to be, taking our adversaries, policymakers seriously. The other thing is, I think we did not expect that the sanctions on the big Russian banks would have so little impact within Russia. I have to give Russia credit here, right? I think that if you'd ask most American policymakers 5 years ago, you sanction all the big Russian banks, that most American policymakers would have had a view, well, that's going to actually be, at least for a period of time, quite disruptive in Russia, because these guys rely on Western service. Like, how are people going to use credit cards in Russia? It turns out the Russians were, starting back in 2018, built a very effective domestic set of payment rails. And so there was an almost seamless transition for domestic payments, not purely for international. International took them some time to do workarounds and things, but for domestic, almost seamless transition. And I think we had to give credit to the fact that they actually have insulated the domestic financial system over a period of years, much more than we thought we had. And they had years. I mean, if you look at the history of Russia, even after the Ukraine, after they invaded Crimea and we sanctioned them, they didn't really start taking seriously the getting away from the US thing. Where they got serious about it was in 2018, after Congress, over Trump's objections, passed sanctions, CATSA sanctions, which hit some Russian oligarchs. That was the point, and this is just on the public data, it was at that point that they pulled almost all their reserves out of the United States, parked most of them in Europe, and started really doubling down on we're going to build an insulated domestic set of payment rails. And we just hadn't appreciated how successful they've been at that.
Okay, we still have time for a few questions, and I want to look for students because there's students here, and I'm going to like nudge the students, and I know you. So I might call on you. Oh, there we go. Let's get a question.
Mike Anderson, first year PhD student, and I'm not a financial expert, but you mentioned the late to the game on sanctions, specifically tied to MIR. How do you see that playing out, and will that affect our credibility, like with China's attempts to continue to break free from the Western financial system?
So I'm pleased that finally, about 6 months ago, the administration began to take some action on MIR. And I think that was an important measure. I do think on China, and sort of where I am, I think like I don't think you're trying to manage like a diplomatic relationship as well as policy. And so I think on China, because we see China very actively going out and trying to, promote sort of swap lines with emerging markets and connect its banks and RMB payment channels. And I think in a way, like China hasn't taken so many actions that there's a lot of policy appetite to impose sanctions on that stuff today. But I think we should be thinking like, are there things the US government could do that would, short of sanctions, like today, we should be thinking short of sanctions, slow down that interconnection. Like, could we go to these governments and say, there might be like money laundering issues through this. There might be like Russian sanctions of Asian, issues you have to deal with if you connect. So why don't you just put on pause for another, 3 years actually interconnecting with this network? And like, I think we should be thinking a little bit more, sort of subtly, like, but today, rather than waiting for them to have fully built out those networks and then trying to, sanction it when things really go pear-shaped with the Chinese. And that probably doesn't mean sanctions. It probably means coming up with various diplomatic and regulatory arguments to try to slow that process down.
There are very few roles that I'm supposed to play as chair, but one of them is to end on time so we don't, run hideously late. So please join me in thanking Peter for